Folks, if you're joining us for the first time, this is the weekly Apologetics Academy that we run every Saturday at 8 p.m. UK time, which is 3 p.m. Eastern, or 2 p.m. Central, or 12 noon Pacific. And every week, every Saturday, we bring in a different scholar or apologist or expert on different fields, and we have them present to us about ideas, and then we open it up to open floor Q&A. There's a number of ways that you can participate. If you are a viewer today, you can participate in the chat window, or you can submit questions anonymously by clicking the Q&A button, or you can raise your hand, and then I will promote you to be a co-panelist with our speaker today, and you can have a back and forth interaction and ask your question, make your comment, or express disagreement, or what have you, or you can simply listen anonymously and enjoy the show. This week, we're blessed to have with us Lydia McGrew, who is a philosopher, and she's going to be talking to us about undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts and how they can be used to support the reliability of Scripture. We also next week have with us Justin Bass from Dallas Theological Seminary, who's going to be speaking to us about his title is "Who is the Son of Man? Jesus of Nazareth and His Claim to Deity." Justin Bass has debated Bart Ehrman and really knows his stuff when it comes to early church Christology. And then the following week we have Dr. Günther Betschley, who is a German paleontologist, who is going to talk to us about the fossil record, evidence for common descent and against Neo-Darwinian evolution. So that will be fascinating as well. So as I said, this evening we have Lydia McGrew with us, and if folks, if you want to ask a question later after Lydia's given us her presentation, I would ask that you please try to keep your question on topic. We sometimes get guests who ask questions that are off topic, and also don't pontificate. Ask a question that has a question mark at the end, and don't go on rambling for a long period of time. Otherwise, I'll have to cut you off. But we hope that we can have some good interaction and some good back and forth, and even perhaps some disagreements and constructive, healthy criticism. So Lydia, do you want to maybe introduce yourself and maybe just kick on to your presentation? That'd be amazing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for having me, Jonathan. And I'm really glad to be here today. What I'm going to be talking about today is the same topic that is the topic of a forthcoming book of mine that has been recently accepted by DeWard Publishing in Ohio. The title of the book is going to be Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. We hope that that will be available in about a year. We don't have an exact release date. It's in the copy editing phase right now and working on professional maps and that sort of thing. But I'm very excited about that. I just wanted to announce that at the beginning. I keep mentioning this phrase, undesigned coincidences. That's been coming up in the announcements of this talk, and it's very understandable that someone would say, what does that mean? What is an undesigned coincidence? So before I go into specifics, I'm going to give a sort of general concept of an undesigned coincidence. Now, in reality, it's much easier to understand these when you see them in practice. They're the kind of thing that, like many other things, is easier to understand when you see a concrete example. But a general concept goes approximately like this. An undesigned coincidence is a notable connection between two accounts or more, or two or more texts that doesn't seem to have been planned by the people giving them. So that's where the term undesigned comes in. It doesn't seem like somebody said, oh, I'll deliberately connect what I'm writing to this over here. And despite their apparent independence, they fit together like the pieces of a puzzle. So I have sort of a simple example that I usually give to introduce undesigned coincidences, sort of an imaginary real life example. Suppose that you have three friends, Alan, Betty, and Carl. And Alan and Betty come to you and they say they're very upset that Carl has admitted to some terrible wrongdoing. He's embezzled funds from your organization or something of that kind. And they say he admitted all of this in a conversation at a cafe, at a coffee shop. So Carl says, this is entirely made up. They're framing me. Never happened. This conversation never even happened. So you sit down with Alan and you say, well, tell me about this supposed conversation. And he says, well, we came there and it was terribly, terribly crowded. We almost couldn't find anywhere to sit. And then he goes on, and with other details, he tells about this conversation. And you sit down separately with Betty and you say, what happened? How did this all go? And she says, well, we got there and we found a place to sit. And, it was so strange that as we were talking, as we were going on, Alan knocked his coffee cup and it spilled right into my lap. It was so embarrassing. And then she goes on and she tells about the conversation in her own words. Now, think about how those two details fit together, that it was extremely crowded. They almost couldn't find a place where they could all sit, and that one of them knocked a coffee cup into the other one's lap. These fit together because if it's very crowded, you're going to all kind of be squeezing around the same table. There's not going to be a lot of room. It would be very easy to knock something off. Now, that's a kind of a silly thing, but in fact, it confirms that they are not making up this meeting. Notice that neither one of them gives both sides of this. Neither one of them says, it was very crowded and Alan knocked his cup off into my lap. We do know that people sometimes just elaborate a lie to make it sound plausible. They just add a lot of unnecessary details. But in this case, they're coming from two different people. It's not the way that you would expect them to talk if they were just colluding. Very, very subtle connection. You would not expect them to get together and say, hey, I'm going to say it was crowded, and you say you knocked your coffee cup off, or that I knocked my coffee cup off. But don't say anything about the crowding, and I won't say anything about the coffee cup. That's not how people generally work if they're colluding. So the fact that you have these details that fit together, that's an undesigned coincidence, and things don't look very good for Carl, because it looks like at least this meeting did take place, and he's denying the thing altogether. Now, one thing I want to mention about the case from undesigned coincidences for the reliability of the Gospels and the reliability of Acts is that it is a cumulative case. You may not find some specific example that I give very impressive. You may say, I think that could just be sheer coincidence. Okay, I wouldn't bring the example forward if I thought that, obviously, but keep listening if you feel that way about a given example, because each one fits in to the cumulative case. Okay, cumulative case builds. No one example or item has to bear the weight all by itself. So I really want to emphasize that. And I have far more of these. This is a sampler. You can think of it as a sampler. I have a few from the Gospels and a few connecting Acts and the Pauline epistles. But I have more than 24 for the Gospels and approximately 20 connecting the Pauline epistles with the book of Acts. And in fact, in Acts, it's kind of interesting, even more than the Gospels. I would say that some of them combine multiple coincidences, and that there's a certain arbitrariness about saying, well, I'm going to call this one coincidence. So it's not, you can't even estimate the case just by sort of counting them up. But that just gives you an idea that there are a lot more of these. All right, so I'm going to start with some gospel coincidences. And I want to ask first, what do these support? What is my thesis here? What point am I trying to make with these? Am I trying to say they were inspired by God? Well, of course, I do believe they were inspired by God, but that's not what I'm arguing for today. Am I trying to say that they are absolutely inerrant, they don't contain any errors at all? Well, that's not what I'm arguing for today. What I'm arguing for and saying that these support is that they were written by truthful people, that is to say, people who intended to be truthful, who had knowledge of the events from close up to the facts, maybe because they were eyewitnesses themselves, or maybe because they were friends or talked to eyewitnesses, and that they are historically reliable. I'm arguing that the Gospels do not represent later accretion or fictional distortion, where things were just sort of randomly added as they grew or as legends grew. It's interesting when you read mainstream New Testament scholarship, more so from what one might call the liberal wing, but sometimes not only there. Scholars will talk about the Gospels as if the authors are making people say things. So Mark has Jesus say this, or John has Jesus say this, makes Jesus say this, has all of the events, happen on this day, or these kind of phrases, this kind of terminology. And it's interesting to see how that terminology, without coming right out and saying it, definitely conveys the picture that the authors are thinking of Jesus and the disciples and the other characters as characters, almost as fictional, that are movable. Okay, you can take them and you can sort of treat them as puppets, like an author of fiction. Oh, I think I'll have Jesus say that. Okay, or then you'll hear the claim that the Jesus of Mark is different from the Jesus of John, as though they are, again, at least semi-fictionalized characters. And I'm going to say that undesigned coincidences give us a very different picture. Okay, they don't give us that picture. They don't show us this picture of the of their treating Jesus in a literary way. Like, I'm writing a literary work. I'm the author of John, and I want to sort of portray Jesus as this and have him say that, this literary approach. What I think the undesigned coincidences support instead is the concept of a reporting approach, a witness approach. I want to tell what happened. I want to get it down. I want to get it out there, get the story out there so people know what happened. And I think that supports what I said I'm arguing for, that they were written by truthful people with knowledge of the events close up to the facts and are historically reliable. They also support the material that is unique to the individual Gospels. Okay, and I'm going to be emphasizing this as I go through, that only John says this or only Mark says that. This is very important because there's this concept, and I call it an Eohippus model. If you've ever seen the little diagram for the evolution of the horse, and I'm not saying what I think about that, I'm just using the term, that starts out with the little horse, the Eohippus, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you get to the modern horse, which is the biggest one. Well, the Eohippus model of the Gospels, guess who the little horse is? That's Mark, okay? And then, depending on whether you think Luke or Matthew came next, I get that there's not absolute concurrence on that, but probably somewhat of a majority Matthew, then Luke, and then, of course, universal agreement, John last, okay? And they're growing. And then the implication of this Eohippus model is that they're growing in a legendary fashion. They're growing in a non-factual fashion. Just as in the Eohippus sequence, they're growing in a way that's not connected to any deliberate design or anything. Well, in the Eohippus model of the Gospels, they're just growing by stuff sort of sticking to Mark, and the ball gets bigger and bigger until you get to John. Now, what that would seem to convey is that the material that's unique, okay, that's not multiply attested, or that comes from later Gospels, is going to be less reliable, that it's going to be more dubious. What's interesting is that undesigned coincidences follow a very different pattern. I've counted them up as I've done my research. The single gospel for whose unique material we have the most undesigned coincidences is John, the latest one, John. Now, if they're true, this is not really surprising. Okay, if John is a reliable eyewitness, this should not be surprising, because we know anyway that John has more unique material than the other Gospels. That's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are generally called the synoptic Gospels, because they're more similar to one another. And John is different. So everybody knows that John is different. But what we find is that where John is different, he gets confirmed over and over and over again. And in fact, the order of the undesigned coincidences confirming unique material is almost exactly the opposite of the typical order of chronology. It goes John, then Luke, then Mark, then Matthew. So Matthew has the fewest confirmations of his unique material. But the order is more or less anti-chronological. Okay, so this is very surprising based on an Eohippus sequence, where we would expect that as we go later and later chronologically, they would become less and less reliable. Okay, so I want to give these examples, and I'm going to emphasize each time the kind of undesigned coincidence it is. And you'll see what I mean by kinds. So I'm going to get started with one about the green grass. And I did give a handout to Jonathan, and I don't know if he had a chance to distribute that to you, but that's okay. You can take notes in the old-fashioned way or anything you want to do here. But this is the first one about the green grass. And the kind of coincidence this is that John explains a synoptic gospel, in this case, Mark. Okay, so in Mark 6:39, it states specifically that Jesus had the people recline or sit down on the green grass. Now, John does mention that there was grass there, but he doesn't mention the color. Mark is unique. He says Jesus had them recline on the green grass. Now, if you look into this, you'll find out that in Israel, move the camera down, I'm being told. Okay. This way. Is that better? I don't know. I don't feel like I'm making eye contact. Here, I'll try it this way. Kind of in between. Okay, I'll do that. Top of my head is cut off, but the world will not come to an end if the top of my head is cut off. All right, so if you look into it geographically, there is only one time of year when the grass is green in that part of the year, and that's in the spring. That's in the early spring. Now, Mark doesn't say anything about what time of year it was. Nothing at all. He just says he had them sit down in the green grass. But now, if you go over to John, John doesn't say the green grass. He doesn't say they sat down in the green grass, but he says that the Passover was nigh at hand. He just mentions this in passing. Okay? So neither one of them appears to be attempting to correlate with the other, even though John is later, and John may very well have had access to Mark. We don't really know for certain, but he may have. There's no appearance here of design. There's no appearance of John saying, aha, Mark says the grass was green. I'll just sort of drop in there that it was almost Passover time. It's very subtle, very subtle. He's not trying to confirm it. He's just telling his story. And the green grass is in Mark 6:39, and it's in John 6:4 that he says the feast of the Passover was near. There's another reference in Mark that mentions the time of year, or gives the impression of the time of year, but only if you happen to know things. And this is Mark 6:31, prior to the feeding of the 5,000. He says there were many coming and going before they went over across the lake, so that they could hardly even eat. And if you look at a map, you'll see that they were probably in the region of Capernaum, and there was a Roman road that ran down there. Josephus reports huge numbers of travelers that used to go to Jerusalem around the time of the Passover. And Mark's phrase, many coming and going, does not just emphasize Jesus' personal popularity, but rather seems to be emphasizing the idea of a bustle going on, that there's a bustle going on generally. Many coming and going. Why might that be? Well, again, there's that statement in John 6:4 that the feast of the Passover was near at hand. So we've got two just little passing allusions in Mark that are well explained in John's account of the same event, the feeding of the 5,000, just by John's passing statement, the Passover was near at hand. Okay, so what this confirms is that both authors had reliable access and at least partially independent access to the events. Okay, that each of them had some details that the other one doesn't have, but that these details are mutually confirming. Okay, so the next one comes from the account of the Last Supper, of the night before Jesus was betrayed, or the night when Jesus was betrayed, when he was meeting with his disciples and he was eating with them. Luke has this interesting account, and he's the only one who says this, that they were bickering about who would be the greatest in the kingdom of God, and that Jesus rebuked them, and in Luke, he rebukes them in these very specific terms related to the meal. Jesus says to the disciples, this is in Luke, by the way, 22, 24 through 27. He says, who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? And of course, they reclined to eat at that time. Surely it's the one who reclines at the table. So he's appealing to their class consciousness, right? We all know, he says, that the one who is greater is the one who sits or reclines, who's taking it easy, who's eating the meal. And the servant is the lesser one, the one who's lower on the social totem pole. But Jesus says, but I am among you as the one who serves. I'm among you as the servant. Now that's in Luke. What's interesting is that really, in Luke, it doesn't say what he means by that. We're so used to thinking of Jesus as a servant, a servant, a servant. If we're Christians, we hear many sermons. Jesus came to serve. And you need to be a servant leader like Jesus. Pastors, if you're a pastor, be a servant leader. That, we don't often stop to think that the disciples hadn't heard those sermons. And the idea of a servant leader wasn't terribly popular at that time either. It's a little bit anachronistic. We have to be careful not to be anachronistic. And it's also interesting that those of us who are familiar with the Bible, we know all kinds of things that if you just read one gospel are not there in that one gospel. So what do we think of when Jesus is a servant leader? Well, we think of his dying, perhaps, but he hadn't died yet. Okay? And he said, present tense, I am among you as the one who serves in Luke. It seems sort of specific, a little mysterious there. What's Jesus getting at? Well, when you go over to John, you find a scene that we're all very familiar with, which is recorded only in John. This is in John 13, 3 through 5 and following. Jesus rises from supper. And he takes off his outer garment and he clothes himself in the way that a servant would with a towel, and he goes around and he washes their feet. Okay? And that's only recorded in John. John is the only gospel that has the foot washing. Well, that makes a lot more sense of what we find in Luke. I am among you right now is the one who serves. You can picture the scene. Now we can put them together. They're bickering. What does Jesus do? He gets up and he does an object lesson. Jesus did this a lot. We have other verses where Jesus puts a child among them when they've been bickering, or when Jesus says, lift up your eyes to the fields, they are white already to harvest. He liked to gesture, he liked to do object lessons. So that's what he does. When they're bickering, he gets up and he clothes himself as a servant and he washes their feet. And it's this very moving scene. And Peter is horrified, I'm not going to wash my feet and so forth. And we know the story in John 13. And then he sits back down and he says, who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? Surely it is the one who reclines at the table, but I am among you as the one who serves. Okay, very powerful, very vivid, but you have to put the two passages together. One very interesting point about this that I realized when I looked back at the passage is that the words of Jesus in this passage in Luke are similar, not the part about reclining at the table, but other parts of them. The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship, but it shall not be so among you, and so forth, when he's telling them not to be like the Gentiles, but to serve one another. Those are very similar to the passage in Matthew, a passage in Matthew and Mark. Okay, but in Matthew and Mark, okay, the bit about it shall not be so among you, and the least among you shall be the greatest, and so forth. That's when the mother of the sons of Zebedee comes. It's several chapters earlier, several scenes earlier. She comes and asks with her sons, and they ask that they may sit on the right hand and the left of Jesus. Now, the standard redaction criticism thing to do is to say, Luke copied that from Mark, but he decided to transpose it to the night of the Last Supper, and he added a few little supperly kinds of phrases about the one reclining at the table and so forth, because he thought that would make it more interesting. He makes Jesus say it on the night of the Last Supper. I mean, that's just straight down the line, because the earlier part of the passage is so similar. But what do we have from John? We have confirmation of precisely those supperly kinds of things that are found only in Luke. And indeed, we have confirmation that Jesus said these words on the night of the Last Supper. He may have said them earlier as well. Nothing to stop Jesus from talking about he that is the greatest among you shall be least, and the servant of all, and saying it twice. The disciples surely needed the reminder. So I'm not saying that Matthew and Mark are wrong, but what I am saying is that Luke appears to have had independent, presumably eyewitness evidence that Jesus did say that kind of thing and did talk about being a servant on the night of the Last Supper, and did say, I am among you as the one who served. So notice what we have here is a confirmation of the bits, the relatively smaller bits that are unique to one synoptic gospel, where we might be tempted in terms of what we might call critical scholarship to simply think that Luke has transferred some words using Mark as a source, rather than that Luke has independent access. And yet we have evidence that Luke actually had independent access to a real event, rather than redacting Mark. I think that's very interesting. Okay, so that's one where John explains one of the synoptic gospels, but it's a different one. In the previous coincidence, John explained Mark. Here, John explains Luke. The next one, rather interestingly, is going to be that the synoptic gospels explain John. Now that's kind of cool, because the synoptic gospels are all earlier than John, and there are a lot of these where there's something kind of odd in John, but the synoptic gospels explain it. You wouldn't expect that. You wouldn't expect that the earlier gospel would explain a later gospel. Okay, but that does happen. So if we go to John 18, verses 10 through 11, we have the night, or the time in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the servants of the high priest come, and they've even got some Roman soldiers with them, which only John mentions. And they come along to arrest Jesus. And Peter takes out his sword and strikes off the ear of one of the servants. And Jesus says, "Put up your sword in its sheath. The cup that the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? The cup that the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" I want to emphasize that this is the only place in the Gospel of John where he uses the metaphor of the cup for his coming suffering and death. Nowhere else in John is that mentioned. So why that metaphor just there? Well, we can say, Jesus liked metaphors, maybe he just made up some metaphor. But there is actually a more specific explanation for his using that metaphor at that moment and saying that the Father had given him the cup and that he must drink it. And to know that, we have to go back to the Synoptic Gospels to find out how that metaphor was on his mind at that time. The Synoptic Gospels have a couple of places where Jesus uses that metaphor of the cup for his own crucifixion, and even for the sufferings of the disciples themselves. One of the passages is the one I had already mentioned, where the sons of Zebedee ask to sit on his right and left hand, and he says in that passage, "Can you drink of the cup that I will drink?" And they say yes. Okay, so that's clearly an allusion there. But more to the point, Jesus specifically uses that metaphor in the agony in the garden in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. Repeatedly, he goes back. And just one example of this is Matthew 26, 39 through 42. Okay? He goes back multiple times. "Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Father, if this cup might pass." He goes back a couple different times. Now it kind of all fits together, okay? Now it kind of all fits together because Jesus had asked the Father that he might not have to die of a crucifixion. And he had asked him in terms of that metaphor, may this cup pass. Then he sees the men coming to arrest him, and Judas comes and betrays him with a kiss, and he knows this is the answer of the Father. The cup is not going to pass. The Father is giving him the cup. He is putting the cup to his very lips. Okay? This is the cup that the Father has given me. And it's vivid in the mind of Jesus in that very night, and that very scene, and that very instance. And therefore, when Peter strikes off the ear of the high priest's servant, he says, put up your sword in the sheath. The cup that the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? But you can get this only if you put John together with the synoptic gospels, that beautiful picture and heartbreaking picture of Jesus accepting the cup at the Father's hand, and how he had already been thinking in terms of this metaphor. Okay, so I'd like to move on to another one. I've been doing this in roughly chronological order, moving through the Gospels. The next one I call God a New Tomb Handy, and this is one where the synoptic Gospels explain each other, and also the same explanation explains something that is mentioned in John. Now, both John 19 and Luke 23 mention specifically that Joseph of Arimathea laid Jesus' body in a tomb in which no one had previously been laid. It hadn't been used. It hadn't been used before. And John uses the phrase a new tomb. But what they don't say is why Joseph of Arimathea happened to have a new tomb hanging around. I mean, if you think about it, I couldn't just go and bury somebody in your burial plot, okay? Of course, one is going to conjecture that it belonged to someone sympathetic to Jesus, one of his disciples, somebody who loved him. You might even think it belonged to Nicodemus, because Nicodemus is also mentioned in John as coming and being involved in the burial. At a minimum, it appears to have belonged to somebody who had this tomb there in the vicinity of Jerusalem, and John even emphasizes that it was nearby, it was near at hand. But neither Luke nor John tells us how Joseph of Arimathea was able to get hold of a new tomb on the spur of the moment, and then go and take the body of Jesus when Pilate gave him permission, and put Jesus' body into a new tomb in which no man had ever been laid. And so we get this only from Matthew. So this is one of those relatively more rare undesigned coincidences where the unique information is in Matthew. Okay. And Matthew, and I have not written down on my own handout, this will be in the handout. Jonathan gave you the specific reference in Matthew, where Matthew specifically says he laid him in his own new tomb. His own new tomb. Okay? That's unique to Matthew. Okay. So Joseph of Arimathea presumably had in mind, I had that new tomb built for me, or cut out, sort of like somebody prepaying their funeral expenses and buying their funeral plot. Okay, I've got that. I can use that as I wish. I'll use that. So he has that in mind when he steps forward and he goes to Pilate and he says, can I have the body? Okay, Matthew 27. He lays it in his own unused, previously unused tomb. And I want to mention something here. Again, Matthew's wording otherwise in just a couple of those verses is very similar to Mark's. He talks about rolling a stone in front of it, wrapping Jesus' body in a linen cloth. If you read just those couple verses right before that, okay, again, what would the standard redaction criticism be to do? The thing to do would be to say, Matthew's getting this from Mark, okay, because, everything comes from Mark, supposedly, all right? And then he's just throwing a couple things in. But Mark doesn't say that it was his own tomb. Okay, Mark doesn't emphasize that. In fact, as I recall, Mark doesn't even emphasize that it was new. Okay, so what we find is Matthew explaining both John and Luke. All right, So those are my gospel examples. As I say, there are more in the book. Read the book. Buy the book next year. Hidden in Plain View from D. Ward. But I want to move on to Acts at this point and give a few in Acts. And I just want very briefly to mention here a few things about the importance of Acts. I have a YouTube video of a talk I gave for Ratio Christi in which I said some of these same things, and you can look that up. And I'm going to say fewer here about that aspect of it, but Acts is important in so many ways. And confirming the reliability of Acts is so valuable and useful. So there are 5 different reasons why Acts is important. First, there's its connection with the Gospel of Luke. The most liberal scholars will agree, not that I'm particularly deferring to them, but there's universal agreement that Luke and Acts were written by the same guy. That doesn't mean they think it was Luke. That doesn't mean they think it was a companion of the Apostle Paul, but that it was the same person. So if we can confirm that Acts was written by a companion of Paul, that it was written by someone very close to the facts, and it was written by someone reliable, this confirms those same points regarding the author of Luke. Its attestation to Jesus' appearance after his resurrection. There is a unique appearance in Acts 1 that's only found in Acts 1. Its attestation to the content of the earliest preachings by Jesus' disciples. You know, I'm a little impatient sometimes when people say the earliest account we have of what the disciples taught is 1 Corinthians 15. Now, I know why people say that, because 1 Corinthians was probably written sooner than Acts, written down, that is to say, all right? But that's placing the text before the events. After all, 1 Corinthians wouldn't exist at all if there hadn't already been a Christian church in existence for Paul, first to persecute, as he himself attests, then to become converted to, as he himself attests, and for him to be instructed by, as he himself attests. So there had to already be people talking about Jesus and telling something about Jesus, or 1 Corinthians would never have come to be written at all if there weren't a Christian church already in existence. And Acts purports to tell us right there in the first couple chapters what the disciples were saying within 2 months, 6 weeks, 40 days. Okay? I should say 50 days, technically, day of Pentecost, after Jesus' crucifixion. Okay? So in terms of actual chronological order, if Acts is reliable, and this is not miraculous, this is just what they said, okay? The earliest account of what the disciples said is not 1 Corinthians 15. It's in Acts. It's in Acts 2. It's Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost. And then following that, what Peter and John said to the Sanhedrin when they were ordered to stop preaching and so forth. All right. Also, Acts is important because of its attestation to the context of persecution in which they gave this testimony. You know, sometimes people will say, and this is fine as a shorthand, the apostles died for the proclamation that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, not all of them did. Patristic evidence is that John lived to a ripe old age, and, you know, although he was persecuted and sent to the Isle of Patmos, but that, in fact, he appears to have not died a martyr specifically. Okay, and now Sean McDowell does have a new book that I have not read about the deaths of the apostles, so I don't want to just diss that. But I have always said that the clearer and the more undeniable thing is that they risked death openly, clearly, early, from the beginning, risked death for their proclamation. And we get this from Acts. We see here Jesus had just been crucified. We see them being thrown in prison. We see them being warned. Stephen is stoned to death. James, the son of Zebedee, is killed by the sword in Acts 12. So he actually does die in Acts. But and Peter's thrown in jail. Okay, so there are all these things. And that tells us that there wasn't a motive for them to just make something up and just lie. And finally, Acts is important because of its connection to the larger Roman world. Of necessity, and in the nature of the case, the Gospels concern a fairly small slice of space-time. Okay, and there are still amazing numbers of incidental confirmations of their knowledge of the times. Okay, but Acts opens up a whole world of additional such incidental confirmations because it moves all around the rim of the Mediterranean Sea, as some of the maps I'll talk about today will show. And so you get a lot more. You get a lot more, and Colin Heemer has collected these just wonderful chapters in his book on Acts, which I highly encourage you to get a hold of a copy of it. So as I like to say, Acts is a large tree that lies athwart the road marked legend or fictionalization. And that road is a road that many New Testament scholars want to be driving down. And they drive along, putt, 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 and they get to Acts. And it's really hard to treat Acts that way because it is so sober, it is so factual, it is so tied into the warp and woof of history. Okay, so what do these coincidences show? I talked a little bit about what the gospel coincidences show. Well, the Acts coincidences show similar things. The truthfulness of the author of Acts, the fact that the author of Acts had access to the facts close up. Okay, the fact that what the author writes in the book of Acts is not the result of legend or accretion. More specifically, the coincidences show an intimate knowledge of the movements of the Apostle Paul and the movements of his companions. Sometimes they even indicate a knowledge of Paul's intentions. What was Paul planning to do even before he did them? They indicate an accurate and reliable knowledge of the history of the church. And they indicate a reliable knowledge of the geography of the regions and the routes that Paul took and would have taken. When you put all of this together, you definitely get a picture of the author of Acts as a companion of the Apostle Paul. And if you want to say it wasn't Luke, then I'm going to say whether it was Luke or not, it was a companion of Paul. And I think this is just very strong. I think the more you read and put together the epistles and Acts, the more you see that this guy was with Paul a lot. He was not necessarily with Paul when all of the events of Paul's life took place, but he was with Paul for some of them, certainly. And of course, we know there are even the famous we passages in Acts where the author of Acts will suddenly drop into that first person plural and say, we went here and we did that. But of course, these coincidences confirm other passages besides that. They don't confirm only the we passages, but they confirm the implication of the we passages, which is that this person knew Paul. Okay, so I'm going to start with one based on 2 Timothy. And of course, as you probably know, the Pauline authorship of the pastorals is questioned. I don't consider it dubious or questionable. William Paley, in his book Horai Paulini, from which many of these are drawn, chiefly uses the undesigned coincidences to support the Pauline authorship of the epistles. I'm using it more to support the reliability of Acts. It actually supports both. And so the first question is, how did Timothy know about Paul's persecutions in particular cities? And I'm going to start with 2 Timothy 3, 10 through 11. Paul says to Timothy, you have followed my life, my teaching, my love, my perseverance. Paul's very dramatic. Paul's a real drama queen. I love him, but I mean, he's just got such a vivid personality. And he says, my persecutions, my sufferings, which I suffered at Antioch, at Iconium, and Lystra. But out of them, the Lord delivered me. The Lord delivered me out of them all. Why those cities specifically? We find that in 1 Thessalonians, Paul says, I was shamefully treated at Philippi. We find that in one of the epistles to the Corinthians, Paul has this like, huge list. You know, I was beaten with rods this many times, and I was shipwrecked this many times, and I was stoned, and a whole big list, which presumably happened in many different places. So why does he pick these particular places to emphasize to Timothy, to say, you have followed these? You followed these. Okay. And of course, because he and Timothy, we can tell, were good friends, he might have told Timothy about many, but he says that Timothy had followed these particular ones. So at this point, I'm going to go to the share screen function here and call up a map. And here we go. There we go. All right. So this is a map of a portion of Paul's second missionary journey. And something that I want to emphasize here is that the arrows here, because it's Paul's second missionary journey, are going in the opposite direction of the direction that Paul actually traveled on the journey when he was persecuted in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. When he suffered these persecutions, according to Acts, okay, he was going from Antioch to Iconium to Lystra. So Paley notes this, that he names these two Timothy in the exact order in which, according to Acts, he came to the cities. And that's kind of cool. So we find that at the end of Acts 13, Paul and Barnabas are in Pisidian Antioch. And they are driven out. And they're just an uprising, and it's like, get out of here. So they leave. They go to Iconium. At the beginning of Acts 14, there's a plot to stone them. So they leave Iconium, and they go to the region around Lystra and Derbe, right here. Well, that doesn't work either, because Paul is actually stoned in Lystra in Acts 14, verses 19 and following. He is left for dead outside of the city. He looks so he looks so knocked out that they even think he's dead, but he recovers consciousness and he gets up and moves on. Now, I want to mention, in these chapters of Acts, Acts 13 and 14, Timothy is not mentioned at all. Timothy has not come on the scene yet. We haven't met Timothy yet in Acts. So Acts is giving no appearance that it's trying to connect this with that mention in 2 Timothy. When Acts tells about Paul's persecutions in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, not a word is said of Timothy. But if you move on into Acts 16, now that is the second missionary journey of Paul that's portrayed, portion of which is portrayed on this map. He comes to the region, okay, right here, this same region, Derbe and Lystra, and it says, and a disciple was there. Early in Acts 16, a disciple was there named Timothy, and he was well spoken of by the brethren there, and he was recommended to Paul, and Paul decided to take him with him on a journey. Now, Paley makes the very interesting comment that since it says that when Paul came to Lystra and Derbe, a disciple was there named Timothy, that meant Timothy was already a disciple by the time Paul came back on his second missionary journey. The implication, since we don't have any evidence of anybody else who evangelized this region, is that Timothy was evangelized and came to be a Christian and a part of the Christian movement on the previous missionary journey, recounted where? In Acts 13 and 14. That's when Paul suffered at Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, and was even stoned in Lystra. So Acts confirms and mentions that Timothy was from the region of Lystra and Derbe, and that he was a disciple already in Acts 16, and had probably therefore become a disciple in Acts 13 and 14 when Paul suffered persecution. All right, I'm going to try to go back here to the screen so I can see myself. Nope, didn't want to do that. There we go. Exited screen sharing. All right. So what does this mean? This means that Acts explains that allusion in 2 Timothy. Timothy would have been becoming a disciple. He would have been becoming a Christian right at the time that Paul was suffering these very persecutions. He might have even witnessed the stoning in Lystra. Certainly it says the disciples gathered around him, and then he came back to his senses. But it would have been very vivid. It would have been related by people in that small region. Everybody would have been talking about it right at the time when Timothy was a new believer. And so Paul says, you have followed my life, my perseverance, my love, my teaching, my sufferings, my persecution, which I suffered at Antioch and Iconium and Lystra. And this confirms that Acts knows what it's talking about. The author of Acts knows what he's talking about. And yet Acts gives no faintest appearance of being based on the epistle at this point. Acts just tells the story of the two different journeys of Paul to that region. Okay, the next one I want to go to is about Paul's funding in Corinth. And I want to go to Acts 18, verses 1 through 6. I'm going to read these from the NASB. And it says, after these things, he, that is Paul, left Athens and went to Corinth. He found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He, Paul, came to them, Priscilla and Aquila, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Okay, so we've got, what's he doing? He's doing his tent making with Priscilla and Aquila, and there's all kinds of fascinating undesigned coincidences connected with Priscilla and Aquila, but I will resist the urge to digress. He's doing his tent making with them, and he's, on the Sabbath, he's reasoning in the synagogue. Okay, so why is he reasoning in the synagogue on the Sabbath in particular? Well, not only because people would have gathered there then, but also because as a Jew, he can't do his manual labor on the Sabbath. He's forbidden to do his manual labor. So during the week, he works, and on the Sabbath, he does his missionary work. But it says, when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. If you know Paul, you might ask, began devoting himself completely, okay, to the word? You gotta be kidding. Paul is about as completely devoted to the word as anybody can be. Paul is zealous. All that zeal by which he persecuted the church, okay, is turned to his missionary labors. So why is it that when Timothy and Silas come down from Macedonia, Paul begins devoting himself completely? Okay, why is that? Well, I should mention there are some little details of the Greek. I think the NASB is a very accurate, very literal translation at this point. So I'm going to go once again to share screen and to map 1. Nope, not map 2, map 1. No. No, no, no. My apologies. I'm going to get that map right up. I'm going to go back to that. Okay, here we are again. All right, so Paul's in Corinth. He's right here. And it says that Timothy and Silas came from Macedonia. That's up here. All right, so they come down to Corinth, and it's at that time when they arrive that Paul is said to begin devoting himself completely to the word. So at this point, I want to go to 2 Corinthians 11, verses 8 and 9. He's writing to the church at Corinth. Later on, he's writing to them. Okay, at a later point, and he's recalling this same period of his life. And he says, and when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So what does Paul imply to Corinth? He implies that somebody who came down to Corinth from Macedonia brought him money. He more or less says that. And in fact, in Philippians 4, verses 15 through 16, he specifically tells the people at Philippi that they were one of the only churches giving him money at this point. And he says, you sent to me, repeatedly, you sent me money. And Philippi is up here in the region of Macedonia. Okay? And Timothy and Silas, we can confirm independently or implied in Acts, had been in Thessalonica, to which money could have been sent for Paul from Philippi. Okay, so we don't know exactly which church it came from, but in 2 Corinthians, Paul's clearly implying that money was brought to him in Corinth at this very time described in Acts 18 from the region of Macedonia. Well, now that's really interesting, okay? Because that would explain it, wouldn't it? That during the week prior to the arrival of the disciples down from Macedonia, Paul was quite literally a tent maker, which is where we get that phrase. He was taking care of himself. He was laboring to take care of himself. But when they came, they brought him money. And so then it says, when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. He didn't have to be a tent maker anymore, for a while at least. He was able to testify all the time and to go out and debate, and meet with people and so forth, because they brought money. Now that's just a fascinating confirmation of Acts. And where am I? I want to get back here to Zoom. There we go. Okay, so this is excellent confirmation of Acts. Notice that the author of Acts might not even have known that they brought money. Certainly he doesn't mention it. It's an extremely subtle confirmation. It looks as though the author of Acts was with Paul at this time, and that he was able to see that he changed his ministry model when when Timothy and Silas arrived. He began devoting himself completely to the word, but he doesn't even bother to say why. It's only when we go to 2 Corinthians 11, 8, and 9 that we find out that the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied his need. I think that one's just beautiful. All right, so the next one I want to go to is starts in 1 Corinthians. All right, so we're going to go to 1 Corinthians 4, 17. Paul says to the Corinthians, I've sent Timothy to you. He's my beloved son. In 1 Corinthians 16, 10 through 11, he says, if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear. Let no man despise him. Don't diss Timothy. All right, he's my messenger. All right, so he's apparently already sent Timothy before writing 1 Corinthians. He sent him on his way on some trip that may, and he apparently thinks probably will, result in his eventually arriving in Corinth, where they are. However, the implication is that the letter is going to arrive before Timothy might arrive, before the time at which Paul expects that Timothy may arrive. That's why he's able to send the letter ahead and say, if Timothy comes, you be respectful to him. You treat him respectfully. He's my beloved son. Let no man despise him. Let no one despise him. So how is it that Paul has sent Timothy ahead, but the letter is going to arrive faster? Obviously, Timothy's not delivering the letter. That's clear. The letter is getting there separate from Timothy. Well, now we go to Acts 19, verses 21 through 22, and it says specifically, Paul's in Ephesus at this time, and I'll be popping up another map here. He's over in Ephesus in Asia Minor, and he is thinking himself of going to Macedonia and Achaia, which were over on the other side of the Aegean. He's planning to go there himself. And he's got all kinds of plans. He says, and then I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and after that I must see Rome. He mentions all his plans in Acts 19. But it says he sent Timothy and Erastus on ahead to Macedonia. Okay, now we have indications elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 16 specifically, that Paul was in Ephesus when he wrote 1 Corinthians. He says, I myself will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. So we already know independently from the epistle that Paul was apparently in Ephesus at the time that he wrote it. And we've got this beautiful place right there in Acts 19, 21, and 22, when it says, but Paul stayed in Asia, meaning Asia Minor, for a time. So he sent Timothy and Erastus ahead to Macedonia, but he himself stayed in Macedonia for a time. So I want to just show you two different possible routes to Corinth. By one of them, he could have sent the letter. By the other one, it appears that he sent Timothy. Okay, so I'm going to go to share screen. Get this. There we go. Okay, two routes to Corinth. Paul's here. He's in Ephesus. He's writing 1 Corinthians. All right. Achaia is the region where Corinth is. Paul himself.
You haven't actually shared your screen at that point.
I didn't share my screen. All right, let's try again. Share screen. Is it doing it now?
No. Try again. If you click share screen, then click the window that you want to open. There you go.
Okay, great. So Paul is here in Ephesus. He's writing to the people at Corinth. He, according to Acts, at the point where I'm arguing he wrote 1 Corinthians in Acts 19, he himself is planning to go to Macedonia and Achaia. There are other indications that fit those plans with 1 Corinthians as well. It's just beautiful. There are multiple things that just intermesh to locate the writing of 1 Corinthians at that point in Acts. And he sends Timothy and Erastus up here by the overland route. They would have embarked at Troas and across and over into Macedonia. And then the implication is that ultimately, even though it doesn't mention this in Acts, they could have come down south to Achaia, going ahead of Paul in the direction that it says he himself was planning to go, to Macedonia and Achaia. So that's one route to Corinth, which we call Timothy's probable route. But the letter could be sent much faster by sea, directly across between two ports from Ephesus to Corinth. And by the trade winds, it would have been quite easy. And Paul was very anxious about the Corinthians. You get this as you read 1 Corinthians. You know, he was really OCD about them. He was obsessing, and you get this from 2 Corinthians as well. So he wanted to get his letter to them as quickly as possible. So he would have sent the letter faster. And that's perfect. The letter goes by the sea route faster. And that's what we call how Paul probably sent 1 Corinthians. And therefore he can say, hey, if Timothy gets there, and I've sent Timothy, and if he gets there, you be respectful to him, because Timothy with Erastus is being sent overland by this longer route. Okay, so I'm going to stop share. Oh, that's much faster to get right back here. Okay, so this is amazing. This perfect dovetailing between these. And yet I want to emphasize something. The book of Acts never says that Paul wrote a letter to anybody. You can read through the book of Acts from cover to cover. You will not find a single Pauline epistle mentioned in Acts. Why do I mention this? Because of the independence that it shows. That the author of Acts is not like trying to work in, okay? I just inferred, and I have more evidence to this effect, that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians right there in Acts 19, 21, and 22. I can pinpoint that. I can do the same thing for Romans. Okay, he wrote it at Acts 20, verse 3. Okay, I can do the same thing for 2 Corinthians. he wrote it in about Acts 20 verses 1 and 2. We can pinpoint when he wrote these things in Acts by other indirect clues. And Acts isn't mentioning the epistles at all. Acts is telling what Paul's intentions were for his travel, where he sent his companions for his travel. But it's not mentioning that he wrote the epistles. It's not even mentioning some of the preoccupations on his mind in the epistles. Okay? So this is a very good confirmation, as I said, that the author of Acts was a companion of the Apostle Paul. Now, those are all of the coincidences I have for my formal presentation here. So I'm going to stop at this point, and I'm going to give Jonathan a chance to be an MC here and to MC the Q&A, where I'll answer questions.
Well, thank you, Lydia, for that fascinating presentation on undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. There are certainly quite a number in there that I hadn't seen myself before, and I very much appreciate you taking the time to present this to us. Gordon has his hand raised. Let me bring him up. Folks, just if you're new here and haven't been before, this is the interactive portion of the program, and basically if you want to ask a question or make comments directed to Lydia, then just click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, and I will then promote you to be co-panelist with Lydia, and you'll have opportunity to go back and forth a little bit using your webcam and or microphone. So first up is Gordon Revolta from Scotland. Go ahead, Gordon.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you very much, Lydia, for your excellent presentation. I have one question regarding coincidence that might just simply be a coincidence. I've asked it on the Apologetics Facebook page before, but that is the connection between John 14:6, Jesus being the way, the truth, the life, and the usage of the earliest followers of Jesus being described as followers of the way, the same Greek words used. Is that simply a coincidence, or is it a coincidence that could show a connection between Acts and John?
That's an interesting one. I'd never heard anyone propose that one before. My own inclination would be to the simple coincidence, if for no other reason, that I suspect that when it says that they were followers of the way, it meant a certain way of worshiping rather than a person. Now, I mean, it could have been a code. You know, they were followers of Jesus the way. But I tend to think that in Acts, for example, when it says Paul persecuted all who were of that way, it gives to my ear, at least, more the impression of there being followers of a certain way of being or a certain way of worshiping or a certain religious sect or something like that. So that's why I would be inclined to opt for a coincidence in the more pure sense of coincidence. But it's interesting, and you can see if you can come up with any other independent evidence that would support it.
Thanks. That's all really.
Great, thank you, Gordon. Let me go to our next hand, which is from Nathan Forstall. Forstall. Bring him up.
Hi.
Greetings, Nathan. You're live with Lydia McGrew.
All right. So my question was, from a skeptic's perspective, if they allowed everything, let's say the gospel specifically, what would they be giving up? Because I think many skeptics generally agree that there's a historical core. Mm-hmm. Assuming there's a historical core, what about Jesus' life would they have to say is true? I think one, from the last one you gave, they'd have to say that the location of the tomb was known, which is one of the arguments in the 4 facts case or 3 facts case, depending on who's giving it. Is there anything else that a skeptic would have to confront with some difficulty, or could they go, well, we'll accept all that. Those are all historical facts. They're all from the actual incidents of Jesus' life.
That's a very interesting question. I think they'd have to give up a lot. For one thing, I have a lot more of these, you know. I mean, I'm just getting started. Okay. But for another thing, I would not want to give the impression that I'm only confirming this one thing that I'm doing. You know, that, okay, like this confirms the incident of his being buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb or something like that. Instead, I'm confirming a broader concept of who the authors were, what sort of access they had to the facts, that they were reliable, and that kind of thing, and that they were truthful, that they weren't just engaging in redaction, that they had independent access to eyewitness testimony, either themselves or someone else. Now, that kind of a picture of the authors is definitely not something that is generally accepted by skeptics. It's going to be very difficult. And it's going to tend to confirm the very early origin of, for example, the accounts of the resurrection. Okay? And what I tend to do, and I argue this in the book, is that this shows that those accounts came from the disciples. Okay, except in one case, which I'll mention in a moment, I don't use undesigned coincidences to argue directly for the resurrection. Instead, I use them to argue that these accounts were not later legendary accretions, because the Gospels don't look like they're full of later legendary accretions. They look like they're from eyewitness sources. Well, if they're from eyewitness sources, then all that stuff about Jesus talking with them or eating with them or whatever, at a minimum, appears to be what the putative eyewitnesses claimed. Okay, then we get into the, were they just lying? Were they hallucinating? These kinds of things. Generally, the more common skeptical strategy nowadays is to say, well, we don't know what the eyewitnesses claim. I mean, certainly that's what Bart Ehrman, for example, would say. We have no idea what the eyewitnesses claim. And my argument is that it's arbitrary when we have undesigned coincidences from all across the Gospels. We have them from early in Jesus' ministry, late in Jesus' ministry, middle of Jesus' ministry, front, back, top, bottom, to say, I mean, we have a very strong inductive case that the whole thing comes from these very early eyewitnesses, from people. And when I say sources, I usually mean people. I don't usually mean documents. And so, therefore, to just pick the resurrection in accounts and say, oh, well, those don't. Okay, those are late and they're inventive storytelling or this kind of thing that Ehrman wants to do, people just sitting around chatting with each other and it kind of grows in the telling. Why say that about those as opposed to there being from people who really were around, who really knew Jesus, who really came to have witnessed them, when we have evidence for that about the documents as a whole? So I'm arguing for this kind of source in eyewitness claims in the documents as a whole. So that's one thing they'd have to give up if they accepted my argument. Another thing, and I didn't do this one today, I talk about this one in the YouTube video that I gave the talk to Rachel Christie here in April, is that there's actually an undesigned coincidence connected with a appearance of Jesus after his resurrection, specifically. And this is the one where he says, "Lovest thou me more than these?" to Peter. And I can give that one at some point if there's time here. And that's not the only one. Today I gave a couple connected with the feeding of the 5,000. So we find that undesigned coincidences crop up, no more, no less. They just kind of crop up in connection with both miraculous and non-miraculous events. Okay, now no skeptic is going to like that. Okay, so what we find here is not evidence of a historical core surrounded by legendary accretion. And the example I give in the book, or the sort of metaphor, is a loaf of bread. If you have a loaf of bread and you eat a piece from one end and it's great, and you eat a piece from the other end, it's great, and you pick a few pieces in the middle and they're great, then to say, well, I bet that just the parts I haven't sampled are moldy, is very irrational. I mean, philosophically, that's very irrational to just say, well, I haven't actually sampled, that particular piece right there. So it's the same way here, that when we find no preference between miraculous and non-miraculous, we have undesigned coincidences. One, as I say, related to an appearance after the resurrection itself. Many related to the feeding of the 5,000. It's the one single incident in the Gospels that has the most undesigned coincidences connected with it, unless you count the trial. There are several connected with the trial, but a lot connected with the feeding of 5,000. One connected with the healing of the servant's ear. One connected with the turning water into wine at Cana. okay, in the circumstances surrounding these stories and so forth. So we're confirming miracles too. So it's they're just not going to be able to, in my opinion, to get away with the historical core response to this argument in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Currently no other hands raised. Let me just make a couple of questions myself. You mentioned the feeding of the 5,000 miracle, and you mentioned the green grass and the people coming and going and so on in Mark, which is then explained by John telling us about the fact that it was taking place at Passover. I don't think, if I recall, that you mentioned the Jesus turns to Philip, which is one of the well-known coincidences there, where Jesus in John 6 turns to Philip to say, where should we send these people to buy bread? And then you wonder, why is he turning to Philip? He's such a minor character in the Gospels. And it turns out from John 1 and John 12 that Philip is from Bethsaida. And then Luke chapter 9, the parallel account of the feeding of the 5,000 miracle tells us that the event actually takes place in Bethsaida. So again, it just adds to the body of cumulative key supporting the historicity of that particular narrative there. Another example that I often use in my debates with Muslims, for example, because I do debates with Muslims and I've debated on topics like Paul or Muhammad, who represents Jesus' teachings, or what did Jesus preach to the form of Christianity, and topics like that. And one argument I often make is that Jesus predicted his impending death and subsequent resurrection, because of course that would contradict what the Quran tells us in Surah An-Nisa verse 157 and 158, which denies that Jesus was even crucified. So if he wasn't crucified, he can't be raised from the dead either. And I often use I saw this one a number of years ago before I'd even heard of the concept of undesigned coincidences. But I wonder if you've seen this one, because I think it's quite a powerful one. In John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, where the Pharisees say to Jesus, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all these things?" And he says, "I'll destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days." And then he's referring to his body, of course, and the Pharisees say, it's taken us 46 years to build this temple. How can you then say you will destroy it and raise it up again in 3 days? And he's talking about his body. And then after Jesus has been raised from the dead, we read that then they remembered what Jesus had said and believed the scriptures. If you look, if you read in Mark and Matthew, Mark 14:58 and Matthew 26:61, when Jesus is before the high priest at his interrogation, and the false witnesses step forward and they say, "We heard this man say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and 3 days will build another, but not by human hand." Of course, Jesus never actually said that, and there's nothing in the Synoptic Gospels that gives us a pretext. But John's Gospel, the independent non-synoptic account, gives us it doesn't tell us anything about the later misrepresentations. It uses an accusation, but it does give us the pretext. You have this hand-in-glove fit, and that really argues, I think, strongly for two things. Firstly, it suggests that Jesus actually had a self-awareness of his impending death and resurrection, which squarely contradicts Islam, and also it really raises the anterior or prior probability of the resurrection, because actually Jesus predicted it and embedded it within a theological context, namely it would be the ultimate vindication of his messianic credentials. And his divine authority. And secondly, it suggests that Jesus had a divine self-understanding or self-concept, self-identity, because he considered his body to be the temple, which is the dwelling place of God himself. He said, "I will destroy this temple," namely, God himself will destroy this temple, namely his earthly body, and then raise it up again in 3 days. And so you got, in that one undesigned coincidence, you have a powerful prediction on the part of Jesus concerning his death and resurrection and his divine self-understanding. So that's another beautiful one.
It is, and I talk about that when in the book. I call it gossip, because what I say is that when they say this, if you just look at the trial scene, to my ear, it does not come across as a complete fabrication. If they had been simply trying to say something to make Jesus look bad, there was no reason for them to mention raising it up again in 3 days. All right, if we think about someone making terrorist threats in our own day, we never have the person say, "I'm going to blow up this airport and I'm going to build it again in 3 days." Okay, we just have them say, "I'm going to blow up this airport," right? If we wanted to put that in a book or something, or if we were slandering someone saying he had made a terrorist threat. So if they could certainly make people mad. Destroying the temple was not something you made jokes about in first century Palestine, particularly in Jerusalem, any more than you would make jokes about bombs at a TSA checkpoint. So they certainly, you could say, chose their example wisely to anger the Sanhedrin. And yet, that raise it up again in 3 days doesn't really fit with a pure fabrication. So what it sounds like, just looking at Matthew and Mark, is a garbled version of something Jesus had really said, a twisted version. In the day of the internet, if we heard somebody say, you know, this political person, this said this outrageous thing, we would say, I bet he said something, you know, sort of vaguely related to that that's been distorted and been twisted in the telling, taken out of context or whatever. And we'd start Googling to try to figure out what the person actually said and what the original context was, because we're savvy to that, to that way that things get messed up in retellings or they get twisted. So I think that in a sense sends us looking for a real word of Jesus to explain it in a very specific kind of way by having that gossip-like sound to it. And then, as you say, we find that explanation only in John. So I think that's a really good one. Yeah,
another really interesting example concerning the trial narrative, which you just mentioned, and the historical reliability of the trial narrative, which obviously comes under immense fire from contemporary scholarship. It's interesting that in the Jewish Mishnah, which is a later idolization of capital blasphemy law in Jewish jurisprudence, we read in Mishnah Sanhedrin 7.5, which has just opened up on my computer here. We read an account of or instructions concerning the trial of one who is condemned as a result of blasphemy. We read, their blasphemer is not liable until he explicitly utters the name of God. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha said, every day the witnesses testify using a substitute name in place of the actual divine name uttered by the blasphemer. Once the verdict has been reached, they would not execute the defendant on the basis of testimony using a substitute name. Rather, the judges send everyone outside and inquire of the greatest witness among them, saying to him, say explicitly what you heard. And he states blasphemy verbatim, and the judges stand upon their feet and render their clothing, and they may not ever mend the rendered clothing. And the second witness says, I also heard like him. And the third witness says, I also heard like him. So what's interesting about the trial narrative is that Jesus is asked by the high priest, according to Mark 14, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And that's interesting for starters, because Mark prefers to refer to the Son of God. So Son of the Blessed is something which has a ring of truth or authenticity about it. But when Jesus says, I am, or ego eimi in the Greek, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming in clouds of heaven. So that's interesting, because he says sitting at the right hand of power. He doesn't say sitting at the right hand of Yahweh, because it seems that it's quite plausible, I think, based upon the Jewish Mishnah, Sanhedrin 7.5, that Mark may well be drawing from a post-trial report, because he uses a substitute name for Yahweh, namely the power, sitting at the right hand of, not of Yahweh, but the power. And the priest, after the blasphemy has been uttered spontaneously and unexpectedly, he rips his clothes, which is very consistent again with the Jewish Mishnah Sanhedrin 7.5. And so it seems that it seems unlikely that the early Christians would have been able to invent an account corresponding so subtly to this later description of capital blasphemy law in the Jewish Mishnah. So that's another fascinating undesigned coincidence that supports, I think, that.
I would say particularly not if they were Christians after the fall of Jerusalem, Gentiles, and so forth. I mean, I suppose you might have some rabbis who were part of the early Christian movement. If they wanted to go, forge something, they could do that. But certainly, if you put any kind of later date on Mark, I just had a commentator come into a thread I was writing about the other day, and broadly declaring that Mark was written no earlier than 70. In that case, it would become all the more remarkable that you would have these connections that you're talking about. The ego eimi that Jonathan mentioned concerning when Mark says that Jesus answered, I am, One interesting thing is that when Luke and Matthew report that same part of the trial, Jesus says, "You have said it," and very literal in the Greek. And when Tim had a discussion with Bart Ehrman, he was talking about a different place where Jesus uses the phrase, "You have said it," in talking with Pilate. And this connects with a different undesigned coincidence. And Tim just casually said it, and Jesus confirms or affirms or some phrase like that what Pilate had said. And, Ehrman jumps on it. He doesn't say, "I am." And he went on and on and on about how Jesus doesn't say, yes, I am, and so forth to Pilate. He says, "You have said." Well, I'm not saying scholars are absolutely unanimous about the meaning of the phrase "you have said," but some confirmation that it is an affirmative, that it is a yes, comes from the fact that Mark gives the very same answer of Jesus to the question of the high priest as "ego eimi," okay, which was that phrase that Ehrman was going on and on about, that it's not there in that other passage of John, where Matthew and Luke give "you have said." So there is some evidence there that the two meant the same thing.
Notice also Bart Ehrman's inconsistency at that point, because Bart Ehrman uses the argument that early church Christology evolved and developed from Mark through to Matthew, through to Luke, through to John. But if you notice, Mark actually is the more emphatic. Mark says, and Jesus says, according to Mark, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man." Whereas Matthew and Luke say, "You say that I am." So it's more explicit and emphatic in Mark than in Matthew or Luke, which is a potent counterexample to the argument. And there's other examples as well like that, such as the centurion, for example, at the cross. Mm-hmm. According to Luke, says, "Surely this was a righteous man," yet according to Matthew and Mark, says, "Surely this was the Son of God." So there's plenty of counterexamples on that as well.
I see a question here in the webinar chat from Nana, who's asking the relationship of my argument to that of J.J. Blunt. And Tim has partly answered that. I get, in the chat, I get a lot of my examples from J.J. Blunt for the Gospels. I would say not all of them, but the majority. Others I get from a few other writers. A couple I get from Tim, and he can't remember where he got them from. So he ends up being cited as a source in my book. But what I'm doing with Blunt is I'm silently updating Blunt. There are various places where Blunt just didn't know about certain things, or he makes an argument from the Greek maybe that won't hold up, or something of that kind. I mean, an example would be that there's this really odd term in Luke, the next Sabbath after the first, or something like that. This very odd term. And Blunt makes a rather convoluted argument for an undesigned coincidence from that term. And it really now is pretty well acknowledged that that's probably a textual corruption, and that Luke is not making some heavy point with that. There are various other places where Blunt needs to be sort of corrected. And so I'm leaving those out. Blunt also doesn't seem to be aware of any concerns about incomplete copying. Now, I myself am not convinced that Mark was definitely the first gospel. I'm on the fence on that. I try to be neutral on Markan versus Matthean priority in the book. Of course, Markan priority is by far the majority view. But if you take Mark to be the first one, then some of, just a few, not a lot, there's maybe 3, of the coincidences in Blunt can be put down to mere incomplete copying by the other synoptics, by Matthew and Luke. So I've left those out. In fact, a couple of them I put into a footnote, and I say, just briefly, these are the ones that I've left out because they might just be incomplete copying from Mark. And I say, I'm not convinced that that's what they are, because Matthew might have been written first, so I'm not just writing them off. But I want to be careful about that, because I am certain, as God made little green apples, that the skeptical community is going to come along and just wave their hands when my book comes out and say, "Oh, this is all explicable by incomplete copying from Mark, or redaction of Mark, because they just keep going back to that little developmental sequence. That's their wheelhouse that they are so comfortable with. And so I'm removing the book from all suspicion of that. So I'm really updating Blunt in a number of ways, and sometimes just expanding upon his argument in various places, or tweaking or improving his argument and bringing it to a 21st century audience.
Great. We have some questions in the Q&A box. Let me just get to some of those. And folks, if you want to engage your video and microphone and talk to Lydia one-on-one, then just raise your hand and I'll promote you to co-panelist with Lydia. So Vlastimil says, on the Jesus the servant coincidence, at the point of the story, he hasn't died yet, but he has by the time the story was written. Doesn't this make the words about his being a servant less surprising to the audience?
I don't think so, because if the audience is supposed to have taken him to have said them, the question then is, what did the disciples think he meant? I mean, the audience knows that it's being claimed in the text that he said these to the disciples. There's no reason to think that the audience thought of this as a fictional book, or that the audience thought of this as something where these words are being put into Jesus' mouth, like we all know, and here's this pious sounding thing that Jesus said. So it needs to be realistic in terms of the context of the story. And that's why I think it does raise a question, because at the point where it comes in the story in Luke, what does it mean, I am among you as the one who serves? And I think to take it to apply to Jesus' death is implausible for a number of reasons. First of all, his being among them is emphatic. And the one who serves, in the immediate context, he's made that contrast between the one who reclines at the table and the one who serves. So that's the implicit contrast. I'm among you as the one who serves, as opposed to the one who reclines at the table. And that's just perfectly in accordance with the foot washing, far more so than being an allusion to his death. But I should say, interestingly, that if you go to the partially parallel passage over in Matthew and Mark, he says the son of he goes a different direction before he gets to which is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves. That's only in Luke, but he does the greatest shall be your minister and so forth, and he says, even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. So there, he does go in the direction of alluding to his death as service, okay, and is very explicit about it, but there's nothing there about reclining at the table. So I take that actually to be some evidence that he gave the lead-in twice, and that he just went different directions with that lead-in about the greatest shall be the servant of all and so forth, on a couple different occasions, perhaps a week or two apart from one another, because the the disciples did keep fighting. But in Mark and Matthew, he does say not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life.
Thank you, Lydia. There was another question. Someone asked, Richard Porter wanted to ask, are undesigned coincidences at all undermined if we take into consideration the possibility that some gospel writers just drop details for the sake of brevity?
Well, that's again part of the reason why I'm not including any that I think could be explained that way. You just don't find. That's kind of what I meant by incomplete copying from Mark. So let me see if I can think of an example here. I believe Mark has both the fact that they blindfolded Jesus and the fact that they smote him and said, prophesy who struck you. And then one of the other synoptic gospels, it's Luke if I recall correctly, simply has them saying, prophesy who struck you. Okay, so you could explain that one by saying that Luke just drops the mention of the blindfolding. And so that's why I don't do that one in talks, and I don't break it out as an item in my book for that very reason. So I think you would be hard-pressed to find a single one that I do. I don't think you can do it with any of these in this talk or any of the ones that I emphasize in the book, where you can just say, oh, you know, all of the information was here earlier, and then so-and-so, when he wrote it, he just kind of dropped part of it later on. I do think sometimes that they left stuff out for, you know, for brevity. I'm sure John, if he was there, knew that the feeding of the 5,000 took place at Bethsaida, but he doesn't say so. Okay, it's Luke who mentions it. So in that sense, you can say John left it out, but just what that still shows is his independence in telling the story. When you're there, or when you're recording what someone said who was there, which is what I think Luke was doing, and you're telling the story, you do select details, okay? But what that gives us again is that image of witness reporting, as opposed to a literary image. It's an image of people who they don't bother to stop and go back. That's exactly right. You know, if you ever talk to a person who was at a battle, or just giving you living history, they do leave out a lot of stuff, but that's how people talk. That's not redaction. You know, that's not like having it all in a source and then just dropping stuff, because when you do that, sometimes it makes it hard to understand things, which would be implausible in that more literary model.
Thank you, Lydia. Nathan, right at the start of the presentation, wanted to know your view on marking priority. It's very slightly off topic, but not quite off topic, because I know that Tim McGrew, for example, had a dialogue on the blog with Ed Babinski several years back, 2011, where Ed Babinski tried to explain undesigned coincidences in view of marking priority. Do you have a view on that?
Well, as I just mentioned, I definitely don't think you can explain undesigned coincidences by marking priority. And any, like I say, the 2 or 3 that I thought might be explicable in that way, I left out. And I left them out for that very reason, because I expected that might happen. And the rest of them can't be. But as I also want to make a distinction. I want to distinguish 2 meanings of the phrase marking priority. One of them is this completely benign, descriptive, Mark wrote first, sort of like Han shot first, you know. Mark wrote first. Okay, fine, maybe he did. There are arguments. It's a fun little puzzle. We can go back and forth. I've been very intrigued by John Wenham's book called Redating. I believe it's Redating the Gospels or Redating the Synoptic Gospels, and he argues for Matthean priority, and that's interesting. And you know, I'm not going to die on that hill, but I definitely think his arguments need to be taken into account. But fine, okay, so that's a very benign, boring, scholarly meaning of Mark and priority, that Mark happened to write first, and then even we could add that there's some literary dependence of Matthew and Luke, the other 2 synoptic gospels, upon Mark. Okay, but then there's another meaning, which is what I talked about at the beginning of the talk, what I called the Eo-Hippus sequence, which is the concept of mark and priority, where everything that's in one of the other synoptics, or possibly even sometimes in John, is the matter of, you know, sort of variations on a theme by Mark. You know, like none of them had any other independent access to the actual events. None of them were eyewitnesses or anything so naive or outdated or old-fashioned as that. They just kind of take Mark and they you know, he's like a pile of Legos or a Lego structure, and they take off some stuff and they stick on other stuff and they change him up, and they change things to other scenes, or they do things like that. So it's this thesis about the evolution of the Gospels from Mark onward. That concept of mark and priority, if you want to use the phrase mark and priority as shorthand for that thesis, is wrong. And undesigned coincidences very strongly argue against it. Many other things very strongly argue against it. It's wrong. It's insupportable. It can't be made to work. So in that sense, I'm totally against that sweeping concept of mark and priority. As far as the more, benign things, simply that Mark wrote first and that there is some literary dependence on the part that, Matthew and Luke had access to it, had read it, maybe even copied some parts. I'm not close to it at all, and it may in fact be true. Another point I do want to make here, however, is that the sheer difficulty of copying in that time period is often vastly underestimated. I have a post about this at my blog. I can get the URL to people if they're interested, where I talk about this, that they didn't have tables. They didn't write on tables and big desks. Now, this is astonishing to me. When I learned this, I said, this should just cause an earthquake in the world of New Testament criticism, because we have this picture that's almost like word processing or something, where you've got Matthew has Mark open in a window on his desktop or something, and he's able to, cut and paste passages of text. Well, of course, we know that's not true, but at a minimum, we have an idea that he could have the Gospel of Mark open in front of him, and then he could have his own, his own papyrus, his own scroll open and be doing this, copying like that. They couldn't do that. They had these little itty-bitty writing desks, and the copyist, all the way back to ancient Egypt, but apparently still in the 1st century, to sit with this thing, it's like what we would call a lap desk, and write. To do the kind of redaction that is pictured by redaction criticism, or to copy vast passages, they would literally have to have a room and the scrolls all laid out on the floor and be crawling around on their hands and knees and take their little desk and go over here and copy. Can you imagine how uncomfortable and difficult that would be? So this raises the interesting possibility that even, and Wenham talks about this, I believe it is, even the similarities we see that we're inclined to think of as literary may more have been a result of memory of someone like Luke having just read Mark or having just read Matthew, and then rolling it up and setting it aside and sitting down maybe with a little outline on hand or something and writing what he wants to do, and giving, and that could explain slight differences in wording and similarities in wording, even when he intended more or less to reproduce what he had recently read in Mark. So I think even from the perspective of literary dependence, we need to not be anachronistic about the conditions of writing in the 1st century.
Great, Lydia, you talked a lot about the internal undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. Do you want to maybe give us 1 or 2 or 3 external undesigned coincidences? Have you done much research on those?
Tim is the man more on those than I am, but I've got a post at my blog where I talk about, I call it the annotated Rawlinson. Rawlinson was an author who has this great passage where he talks about the Gospels and all the ways in which they get things right about the 1st century, which is the kind of thing you're talking about. For example, the relationship between Roman law and Jewish law. When they come to Pilate and they say, we can't put anyone to death. Okay, and Pilate, you can't put anyone to death, and so that's why he sentences Jesus to death. Again and again and again, they get these little things right about the 1st century, and as Rawlinson points out, all of that was destroyed in AD 70, that whole delicate interrelationship. I will give one from Acts that I love this one. This one is from Colin Hemer, concerning the centurion who almost has Paul flogged when he's rescued him. Getting rescued by the Romans was no easy matter. You could get rescued one minute and be flogged the next. And so he's going to order Paul to be flogged. And Paul says, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. You can't, you can't flog me. And the centurion says, you're a Roman citizen? He says, oh, really? He's obviously a little skeptical. And he says to Paul, with a great price, I bought my Roman citizenship. I bought my freedom. Implication, how much did you pay for your freedom? And Hemer has this wonderful discussion of it in which he points out that Dio Cassius confirms the selling of citizenship under that emperor. I believe it's Claudius. Yeah, it is Claudius. That during Claudius, citizenships were sold. So the centurion is alluding to that practice of buying and selling citizenship. Okay, but it gets better. It gets better. That's not all. Apparently, Dio Cassius also confirms that during the course of the emperorship of Claudius, the price of citizenship fell. Okay, so what do we have? We have this centurion, whose name, by the way, is Claudius Lysias, which would fit with a practice that he might have taken the name of the emperor when he bought his freedom under that emperor. He paid a higher price, and it's just like, if you bought a house before the 2008 crash of the housing market in Camden, New Jersey, maybe Camden's not the best example, but or in Massachusetts or something, and you paid X $100,000, and then comes the crash, and someone comes along and buys a house in your same neighborhood for far, far less. And there's a little bit of envy there, with great price, I bought this freedom. So what is Claudius Lysias thinking? He's thinking, oh, you're one of those new guys that came along and you bought your freedom on the cheap when the price fell for buying citizenship. And Paul says, no, I was born free. So he's got a little zinger there that he's been a Roman citizen all his life. What's astonishing about this is we've got, 2 verses here. And we've got like 3 different points of connection between Roman history and practices and that dialogue in the book of Acts. And this is what I love Hemer for. He's got list after list after list of these items. But I like that one so much that I put it in a footnote in the book, even though the book is mostly about internal coincidences.
Right. Another interesting example of an external coincidence in the Gospels is where you have, and it's fascinating that the Gospels have 2 high priests, and of course anyone familiar with Jewish law recognizes that the Jews only ever had 1 high priest in their history, and so it's fascinating that if they're just making the story up and trying to make it sound realistic, it's likely that they would have 1 high priest rather than 2, because obviously Caiaphas and Ananias are described as being high priests. And it's even interesting that John, in John chapter 11, I think, says that Caiaphas, who was high priest that year,
yes,
which is also interesting. And if you read Flavius Josephus, we learn that Pontius Pilate had a predecessor called Gratus, and in AD 16 he deposed Ananias and instated a line of other high priests. And in AD 18 he appointed Caiaphas as the Roman appointed high priest. And it seems that Ananias still retained great influence and may have even been recognized as high priest by the Jews, in addition to the Roman appointed high priest, who was Joseph Caiaphas. And so that's another interesting undesigned coincidence that's external, where you have an external source, namely Flavius Josephus, corroborating what we read in the Gospels. Another interesting one is in Matthew 2, where we have Archelaus, the only mention in the whole Bible of Herod Archelaus. Mm-hmm. And according to Matthew 2, Joseph was afraid to enter into Judea because he heard that Archelaus was reigning in place of his father Herod, and that raises the question, well, why was he afraid? Mm-hmm. And then Flavius Josephus tells us that there was in his Antiquities, that there was a riot among the Jews resulting in the death of some of Archelaus's men, and so in a rage he sent his entire army upon the Jewish temple at Passover and locked the doors and slaughtered 3,000 Jews in the temple, which then explains why Joseph was afraid of Archelaus.
There are several of those, and the one that you mentioned about the high priest that year, I don't remember who it was, but Tim's often talked about this, that uses this to ridicule the Gospels, that they must be inaccurate. And yet, as Jonathan, as you've just pointed out, actually it ends up turning on them and being a confirmation of the accuracy of the Gospels and Acts as well, because if I recall, there's the scene where Paul says, oh, excuse me, I didn't know that he was the high priest, when Paul is in trouble in Acts. And again, that fits with this kind of tense situation where the Romans would put their own favorite guy, in there for political reasons, and Paul probably didn't approve of that too much, and there were, you know, some ambiguity surrounding who the high priest was. So this happens quite a lot, that the very thing that is said to be a disconfirmation of the external accuracy of the New Testament will end up being a confirmation of its accuracy when investigated in more detail. And somebody asked here if I can post the links that I've mentioned somewhere, and because the chat's going to disappear later on, what I'll have to do is probably go back and listen through, you know, or try to remember which ones they are. A couple of them, if I recall correctly, are on the handout that Jonathan has available, but I can try to, you know, get a list of them, or Jonathan or I or Tim can go through and kind of listen and say, okay, you mentioned this, you mentioned this, you mentioned this, and then we'll get out a list of links that can maybe be posted on the webpage or something later on.
Or if anyone would like a transcript of the chat window, I can save and send to anyone who requests that as well. One interesting example that, because we have any hands raised, so I'm just commenting on other things. If anyone wants to raise a hand and ask a question or make a comment, then feel free to do so, and we'll make you a co-panelist with Lydia. Another interesting example of an undesigned coincidence pertaining to Pauline epistles, which I have written on in the past, is in 2 Corinthians 11. We have Paul's description of his sufferings and his description of him escaping from King Aretas, where he says, verses 30 through 33, if I must boast of the things that show my weakness. If God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. It's interesting that in the account in Acts chapter 9 of Paul escaping by being let down in the basket in Damascus, he doesn't make any mention of King Aretas at all. And so 2 Corinthians in his epistle, he actually gives us this incidental off-the-cuff remark. And he's clearly not deriving that material from the Acts of the Apostles. And nor, it seems, is the Acts of the Apostles deriving its material from 2 Corinthians, because in 2 Corinthians, first of all, we have lots of mention of Titus, who never actually appears in Acts at all. 2 Corinthians has a lot of allusion to this fellow named Titus, but he never appears in Acts, which is interesting. And also, the list of sufferings in 2 Corinthians 11 that he gives from verses 21 through to 29, that cannot be, that does not correspond to the book of Acts. And so clearly the book of Acts is not constructing its narrative based on this. And so again, you have this hand in glove fit, which suggests the authenticity of this. And for folks interested, I wrote a whole article on the historicity of the Damascus Road conversion of Paul, where I look at some of these examples and how it converges on the historicity of the Damascus Road conversion.
Yeah, I would say that example that you just gave of being lowered in a basket is one of the only cases between Acts and the epistles where it's literally recounting the very same event. You know, it's like one of the only ones that's like the ones in the Gospels. I was talking to another apologist a year or so ago when I was writing the book, who said to me, I don't know how you would do it with Acts. He hadn't seen these. How would you do it with Acts? Because Acts, you don't have 4 different accounts that tell about the same events. And it is true that the majority of the undesigned coincidences between Acts and the epistles are of the kind that I gave today, which I love. I mean, I think in some ways they're even more beautiful. But they're not of that kind where like Paul tells an event and then Acts tells an event. But the example that you just gave, Jonathan, is of that kind where they're both telling about his escape from Damascus. There are other, lacks of parallel. For example, in Acts, if I recall correctly, it says that the Jews laid a plot for him. Whereas in 2 Corinthians, to seize him, whereas in 2 Corinthians it says that the governor under Aretas sought to seize him. Okay, so why in the world? Now you can just imagine a skeptic coming in here and making a contradiction out of this, okay? That one says it was the Jews who tried to seize him, and the other says it was the servants and the soldiers of the governor who tried to seize him. And very, very often you'll find that these so-called contradictions simply show the independence of the narratives, and they're not really contradictions at all, because the word for governor there in 2 Corinthians is ethnarch. I believe this is the only time that word appears in the New Testament. And that ethnarch would have been, how can I put it, intended to kind of keep the Jews happy, very likely, to deal with Jewish affairs in that area. And so it's entirely possible that the Jews went to the ethnarch and said, you know, we want to catch this guy, we want to stop this guy. And then as to who was actually lying in wait, he could have given them permission, or he could have sent soldiers to try to capture Paul. That kind of cooperation happens all the time. It's evident, obviously, in the crucifixion of Jesus itself. So there's really no contradiction there at all, but at the same time, there's very evident independence. Now, the source of both of them may have been Paul. It may have been that he told the author of Acts this story in one set of terms, and then that in 2 Corinthians, he tells the story in somewhat different terms, giving somewhat different details. But that's still evidence that the author of Acts had independent access to the Apostle Paul himself and to someone who actually knew the story, because the core of the events is exactly the same: his being in danger and being lowered from the window.
Great. Another interesting example of an undesigned coincidence, which is also related to the Damascus Road conversion incident, because obviously you mentioned the fact that the 2 Corinthians 11 is the only one where he actually narrates the same event that we read of in the book of Acts. There's actually quite a number of allusions in the Pauline epistles to his conversion experience on the road to Damascus.
Sure, I should correct that. You're right about that. Yeah.
So, and these are interesting because, for example, in Galatians 1:11-16, we read, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and had called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus." And so what's interesting in this text is that that there's no mention made of the locality of Paul's conversion, right?
Until later, right.
So you get this casual expression at the end of verse 17, which is just there for just an incidental off-the-cuff remark, where he indicates, and it's completely brought in for a completely different purpose as well, indicates that it was at Damascus. He returned again to Damascus, which is very consistent with the account that we read in Acts, where Paul reportedly encountered Christ on the road to Damascus and subsequently met with Ananias in Damascus, where he receives the Holy Spirit. And so that's another really awesome example.
I have that one in the book. I returned again to Damascus. And one thing I want to emphasize about that is that it's in Galatians 1, and it's in Galatians at all. And as you're aware, and I'm sure many of the other people here are aware, Galatians is used as just a club with which to beat Acts. I mean, again and again, we can't figure out, we can't match up each of the trips that Paul makes to Jerusalem in Galatians. We can't figure out for sure which of the trips in Acts they correspond to, and so forth. And this will be spun as showing the inaccuracy of Acts. And so it's particularly cool that you have an undesigned coincidence in that very casual use that you just gave right there in that very part of Galatians that is often used against the accuracy of Acts. It certainly shows the independence of the two, that people can create these so-called contradictions, but in fact there aren't any contradictions at all. And I think it's very important for us to sometimes put these things in their proper perspective and to say something like, we don't know exactly which of Paul's visits he is alluding to in Galatians. Now, that's a very neutral way to put it, as opposed to Galatians contradicts Acts, because it mentions a visit that we can't find in Acts, or it mentions a visit that doesn't seem to correspond to a visit in Acts, or something like that, which is a very tendentious way of putting it. Something I say in the book is, I say, you might wonder, the reader might wonder why I don't more often deal with, and I hardly ever do, I just mention them very briefly, alleged contradictions in the Gospels or alleged problems with Acts or that kind of thing. Like, why don't I have a section on the census or whatever? Well, one obvious answer is, well, everybody else is doing that. I'm trying to do something different. I'm trying to do something that hasn't been done, but that's a little flippant. A better reason is this. You want to take these things and put them in a context. And something like that example about Damascus, and then many, many others, including the ones I gave today, are a background for our evaluation of remaining places where we maybe can't figure out how what Paul says in Galatians fits in Acts. Whereas if we start at it, and I don't want to take anything away or say anything negative about people who will post sites on Bible difficulties. I'm all in favor of that. I'm all in favor of harmonization and so forth. But it can be this tunnel vision, like we forget the forest for the trees. So if you find a site that says, here are 12 allegations that Acts is inaccurate, and we're going to go through them one at a time and give various answers that could be given, that's great. Go for it. Do that. But there can be a problem there, because it could accidentally give the impression that Acts is an embarrassment. It could accidentally give the impression that our approach to Acts has to be from a defensive posture, that, well, we know we have all these 12 problems in Acts, or 20 problems in concerning Acts and how it fits with the epistles, and I've got answers, I got answers, folks, it's okay. Okay, that's not what I want to do. I want to say instead, oh my goodness, you want me to defend Acts? Does want to defend a lion from a sheep? Acts can defend itself. That Acts has this just vast weight of evidence for its reliability and its source and a companion of Paul, so much so that these remaining things where we're not quite sure how it fits together just shrivel into insignificance in comparison. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do, and something similar for the Gospels as well.
Yeah. We also it's also interesting concerning the conversion of Paul, that he also tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that last of all he appeared to me as to one untimely born, which again comports very well with the book of Acts, that it was a different kind of resurrection experience, and then the details are then filled in the book of Acts. So that's another thing which seems to converge on the historicity of that. And also it's interesting that Paul tells us himself about his sufferings for his conversion. In 2 Corinthians 11, he gives us a laundry list of what he's experienced. And we also have other sources, such as Luke and Clement of Rome, who are both early, who tell us about the sufferings of Paul. And both Clement and Luke were connected with Paul. Paul might even mention Clement in Philippians 4, if it's the same Clement of Rome. And there's some reason to think that it may well be, because the names that are mentioned at the end of Philippians 4 are names that or rather he says at the end of Philippians 4, he alludes to the members of Caesar's household. Mm-hmm. And in Clement, at the end of Clement's epistle to the Corinthian church, he mentions the elderly envoys towards the end of his epistle. And their names are what you might expect to be associated with members of the royal employment. And so that, again, is another undesigned coincidence between Philippians and First Clement, which might suggest that the Clement spoken of in Philippians 4 is the same individual as who wrote First Clement.
You definitely can connect it with these other things. There's of course, the Gallio rescript is one of the most important things, and Heber talks about that as being a really fixed point in Acts as to when Gallio was the governor. And that allows us to date that chapter of Acts. And if I recall correctly, I believe it's Acts 18. Allows us to date that, and then that helps us to date the other events in Acts from the proconsulship of Gallio. And one thing that I often bring up in that connection is this sort of interesting move in connection with the minimal facts approach. The minimal facts approach, which I would like to replace with a more maximal approach, is often relying on the idea of the earliness of the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, and that's connected to the conversion of Paul, and that the conversion of Paul happened, pretty early after Jesus' crucifixion, and then that he would have been taught this creed very shortly thereafter when he was an early convert and that kind of thing. Well, if Acts is not reliable as an account of the early church, an account of what the gospel, what the apostles were saying and so forth, how in the world do we know when Paul was converted? Okay? You have to use stuff from Acts, and I would say that proconsulship of Gallio is useful, and various other, aspects of Acts sort of counting backward to Paul's conversion, to have an idea of how early Paul's conversion was, to therefore have an idea of how early 1 Corinthians 15 is. But now, if you're going to rely on Acts as historically reliable, then we shouldn't be so diffident about relying on the early chapters of Acts as a reliable account of what the disciples were preaching, or relying on the first chapter of Acts as a reliable account of something the disciples said about their meeting with Jesus and his talking to them and being ascended and so forth. So in some ways, you can't have it both ways. You can't treat Acts as or Luke, for that matter, written by the same person, as sort of off limits. I'm going with what's acknowledged by all, umpteen% of scholars. I'm not going to rely on anything that's not historical bedrock, etc. And then at the same time say, the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is early because it was probably taught to Paul shortly after his conversion, and his conversion probably occurred only a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, because you don't get that from the epistles themselves, any kind of dating of Paul's conversion.
And the fact that Paul was willing to suffer for his faith and his testimony and his conversion suggests that he was at least sincere. Because Paul tells us that he suffered for his faith, and also, as I mentioned, Luke and Clement, and then some second century authors also tell us that Paul was martyred and was suffered immensely for his faith. And so that suggests he was at least sincere in his belief that that's what happened, because he actually tells us it's his own eyewitness testimony. 1 Corinthians 15, he gives his own, and also 1 Corinthians 9, have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? So we have, 1 Corinthians tells us, Galatians tells us, and we have Paul's own testimony in multiple letters that he witnessed the resurrected Christ, and that led to his radical conversion from his Pharisaical Judaism. And so he was at least sincere. Then the question, of course, is raised, well, how did he come to that sincere belief? And it seems to me that the best explanation for that by far is that indeed he really did encounter the risen Christ. I mean, Paul wasn't an idiot. Paul was an intellect of the first class. And so the way he used to persecute the church, and he was well schooled in Judaism, and how he went from that state to being the radical Apostle Paul, one of the greatest missionaries in all of history, if not the greatest missionary in all of history, it staggers. It just simply beggars belief, unless indeed he actually did encounter the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus, as he tells us he did.
I agree, and that's why in the article that Tim and I wrote some years ago for the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, we did use the conversion of the Apostle Paul as one of our facts to be explained, our data points. And another point, of course, is that Paul doesn't seem to have been crazy. Exceedingly zealous, sometimes reckless, but not insane. And so then that makes it hard to to explain it as a hallucination, or he was just going nuts or whatever, which people have tried to do, that he felt guilty or something and had a hallucination. But that's just highly implausible, because then he just goes on being his sort of business-like self and gathering up money and doing all kinds of things. And he's obviously a man of affairs, not only highly intelligent, but also highly practical, which makes it extremely difficult to explain. Now, I have to admit, the argument from conversion can cut in a multitude of directions. There is I don't know if I should bring this up, but there's a science fiction author. His last name is Wright, and at the moment I can't remember his first name. He's Roman Catholic and claims to have been converted from atheism directly to Roman Catholicism by near-death experiences that he had when he had a heart attack. And according to him, he was an ardent atheist. He's a real character, this guy. Anyway, he was an ardent atheist, and then he did one of these, God, if you're real, show yourself to me kind of things. And I believe it was the next day that he had a heart attack and was in, close to death. And according to him, the Virgin Mary appeared to him in his time that he was unconscious. And that's part of the reason that he converted specifically to Catholicism, as opposed to just, some other version of Christianity. So Wright is a kind of an Apostle Paul type figure, very much of an about face that he did there. But I'm not Catholic. So, but sometimes I will use that as an example of the fact that you can have a piece of evidence that is evidence for some conclusion, but that then you still conclude that that conclusion is false on the basis of other evidence, but you have to admit that there is some evidence for it. And I would take the conversion of John Wright, I think that may be his name, the conversion of John Wright from atheism to Catholicism by a sort of Damascus Road experience to be some evidence for Catholicism, even though I don't draw that same conclusion from it. But that just shows that we have to be very flexible in our use of evidence and be willing to acknowledge contrary evidence.
Yeah, I see we're down to 13 people. We peaked at 27, but so people are kind of...
Okay, well, I'm going to be probably leaving within the next, I would say, 10 to 15 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be wanting to leave. So we'll see if there are any other questions that anybody would like to ask. And if not, we could wrap up a little earlier.
Sure. Does anyone have any last minute questions that they would like to raise? If so, just raise your hand. I'll give you 2 minutes. And if there's no hands by then we'll wrap up.
I'll give another example during that time of the way that something that might, if we emphasized the appearance of problem or contradiction, we would get a wrong view of the actual evidence. After the feeding of the 5,000, it specifically says, and I don't have the references right here, but that Jesus told the disciples in one of the Synoptic Gospels to set out in the boat, and then it's usually translated toward Bethsaida. Pros is the Greek word, toward Bethsaida. And then in other places, it appears that the feeding of the 5,000 took place right around Bethsaida. So if they were setting out to go across the lake, across the top of the Sea of Galilee toward Capernaum, they would actually be going away from Bethsaida. So this is a little conundrum. It's a prima facie conflict. Did Jesus send them out in the boat toward Bethsaida or away from Bethsaida? So this can certainly be brought up as an alleged discrepancy in the accounts. But as I point out in the book, the location of the feeding of the 5,000 near Bethsaida is multiply confirmed. It's confirmed by the example that Jonathan gave a minute ago concerning asking Philip, and that Philip was from Bethsaida. It's also confirmed by the fact that Matthew says, "Woe unto Bethsaida, for if the mighty works that have been done in you were done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented in dust and ashes." And in Matthew, we find no mention of any mighty works being done in or near or around Bethsaida. But Luke specifically says that the feeding of the 5,000 took place in a desert place near Bethsaida. So what this means is that the location of the feeding of the 5,000 is not an embarrassment. If we simply went at it by saying, oh boy, we got this discrepancy, Jesus sent them pros Bethsaida. But Luke said it took place near Bethsaida, we've got a conflict, and we started discussing it. It could give the impression that the location of the feeding of the 5,000 is an embarrassment to the advocate of the reliability of the Gospels. But it's not an embarrassment. In fact, the location of the feeding is a confirmation of the reliability, because we have two different undesigned coincidences that all both focus on the claim in Luke that the feeding took place near Bethsaida. Now, once you understand that, then when you come along and you say, okay, pros might mean over against, it can be translated over against. So he sent them away in a boat over against Bethsaida is a possible translation. I'm not going to die on a hill for it, but it is a possible translation. That's a resolution, and someone might say that's just ad hoc. You're just a closet inerrantist or an out of the closet inerrantist, and you're just committed, because Bart Ehrman's always out there trying to get people to, you're an inerrantist, okay? Like this terrible thing, and you're just committed to it a priori, and you're going to find something to say, and it might give that impression. But we actually have ample independent evidence as to where the feeding of the 5,000 took place. So that's why I want to put it that way. I want to say, let's look at the evidence for the location of the feeding of the 5,000 as evidence for the reliability of the text. Then that's the background against which one considers this small apparent discrepancy, and that makes one the more willing to consider possible resolutions or harmonizations concerning those texts. And I think that's a service that I have to offer, and that I can offer in this book by giving people a sense of the strength of the positive case. And I want to do that. I want people to do that, and to get that, so they get this sort of sense of kind of rising up above the welter of apparent discrepancies or alleged discrepancies and counterclaims, and getting a sense of the lie of the land, that we've got the bulk of the evidence strongly on the side of the reliability of these texts.
Great. Well, we don't have any other questions or hands raised, so we can probably begin to wrap up. But thank you, Lydia, so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure having you, and I certainly have learned quite a bit from having you on, and I'm sure that the audience have as well. So this, for those listening, this will be on YouTube at some point in the coming week, so you can go back and get the references and recap on what we've learned, because I know there's a lot of material there, and you might not remember every single reference and verse that Lydia brought up. So
great, and I'll look forward to getting the link from you that I can send to other people who weren't here today, and that kind of thing, to the whole thing, so they can listen to it later. Thank you so much for having me, Jonathan. Take care.